And that was when I got a gig that was going to be full time for, like a month. So I was like, well, cool. Oh, and then after that, I really got to, I don't know, full jobs or I'll do something. And that was when the adoption goes through. So, we went from nothing to 3 weeks later having, it was 20 days between when we first got the phone call, or not even. It was like just over 2 weeks, I think, between like the first phone call we got of there's a potential match to a tiny human in our apartment in Brooklyn.
Welcome to Gap to Gig, the show for dads navigating the in-between season when work, identity, and priorities start asking different questions. Here we talk about what that season looks like and how to move through with intention. I'm your host, Michael Jacobs. Today on Gap to Gig, I'm thrilled to welcome Mike Weyandt, an ICF certified executive and career coach, lifelong performer, and student of what it takes to thrive at work and at home. Mike has an uncommon path. He trained and performed as an opera singer in some of the most demanding contemporary works, then transitioned into helping teams and leaders grow at startups and organizations, including co-founding a boutique talent consultancy and serving as a fractional head of talent for high-growth companies. Along the way, he's coached executives and founders to unlock clarity and confidence, and he brings a reflective, practical lens to what it means to succeed both professionally and personally. Most importantly for this audience, though, Mike is a dad to a spirited 7-year-old daughter that he and his husband adopted, and he's navigated the push and pull of meaningful work and being present at home in ways that will resonate with dads tuning in today. Mike, I'm so excited to chat with you today. Welcome to the show. I'm really glad you're here.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
I appreciate that. So you've had this fascinating mix of artistry and leadership and now fatherhood. I love to start kind of at the beginning and understand how those threads sort of connect. Can you take us back to those early years as an opera singer? What did performing at that level kind of teach you about pressure and identity and presence?
It's a great question. One of the things is like the most obvious showbiz thing, which is the show must go on. But it really taught me, like, when it's go time, it's very literally go time, right? Especially in opera. I mean, it's not, you can't wait for your entrance, even like an actor could. It's like the music is where it is, and you're either on time or you're late. The conductor's stick is coming down, and you're there when you're supposed to be, or you're not. And if you're not, it's very obvious, right? Good, especially if people are familiar with the music you're doing. And I bring that up because really what it taught me, which I don't think I appreciated until much, much later, was almost like forced turning on and off, being present. And what that felt like. It didn't necessarily make it easy to do in other circumstances, which is something I can get later. But I realized once I started working, talking about training as a coach, especially, but other related things where the topic of presence came up a lot. I realized, like, oh, I do know what that feels like when it's working. I don't necessarily have self-command where I can put myself there instantly in any situation, but this is not sounding like abstract theory to me. I go, right. Oh yeah, it's feeling, in flow in a certain way, in focus in a certain way. I assume a way that I was never a good athlete, but the good ones probably can be, this kind of like in the moment flow state thing. And I think that, like, knowing what that felt like in my body and knowing what my mind felt like when it's in that state is probably, in retrospect, what I learned the most.
So I never thought about that. Like, performance it's a form of presence, right? Like you said, if your timing's off, if you're not present when you're supposed to be, like in your case, singing, it's noticeable. You've missed that mark, right? And that kind of carries over to other aspects of life. Mm-hmm. If you are working, if you're coaching, or even if you're just whatever type of job you have to be there in the moment to focus on what that task is at hand. And then, of course, parenting is all about presence, right? Like, your child will know, your spouse will know if you are not present in the moment that is important to the family unit, or even outside the family with friends or people you respect. Like, that form of presence of being active in the moment on time, right? So people aren't waiting for you, is so important. I never thought about, like, how that comes from performance and from opera singing. It's really interesting because
Well,
I know like opera demands focus, right? Like I'm not an opera singer. I know very little about it. I appreciate the art, but and I know that to be a prolific singer, you need to have focus, right? You need to focus on the music, the physical part of performing,
mhm.
and like when the curtain goes up, you have to be there, right? So
Yeah. And you know what I would say? You also learn about when it's not working, what's like, it can be very cut and dry. I think in some ways it's very similar to something like any like fine motor skill, like a golf swing or something where you really work on it. And you have that awareness of, I can think about it before, I can think about it after, I cannot think about it during. Like once you
yeah,
start the thing, you're doing it. Because the other thing you learn about presence is what it's like to not be present, in the sense of, this is the kind of mental chatter that, like, I will miss my entrance if I don't stop obsessing over what I'm nervous about, for example. So it's
right,
not just, oh, these kinds of thoughts are kind of negative, or these kind of thoughts are distracting, or these sorts of thoughts are, make me feel bad, and I have to counter that to, it's like, oh, this is what it feels like to be in a thought loop where I lose a sense of time enough that I will be late, or I have been late. So there's that side too of like learning what it feels like to be a little bit out of the moment because you're mentally someplace for
right,
whatever reason. It doesn't have to be something major either. It could be like, you're thinking about like, oh God, Jamal was really boring yesterday. I won't do that again today. This is the fourth rehearsal. You could be checking out for a million reasons, but the point is then you go, oh, I was out of it. I was somewhere else. And yeah, now we have to, if you're in rehearsal, that's okay. But then you have to start over and whatever.
right, right. And I imagine that that comes from experience, right? Like you kind of have
Totally.
to go through that experience of what is making you nervous, what is making you not focus in that moment to realize like, oh, I missed my mark because of this.
What 100% is it's not a thing you're thinking about in advance. It's not that it's like, oh, it's that feeling. Oh, and it's like, I'm doing this. And there's going to be little tells that you have, like, oh, if my, this maybe sounds overly granular, but it can be just like, oh, when I do this thing with my body, oh, when I start pacing, or when I look up in a certain way, or, whatever the physical habit is that's associated, if there is one, there often is, you really start to learn that, but after the fact,
Yeah,
after it's happened three, four, you know, more times.
absolutely. You say pacing. I'm a big pacer myself, and I realize oftentimes either I'm trying to burn off energy or I'm anxious, right? It's one
Hmm.
of those two things. It's like I can recognize that now when I'm starting to do that.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
When I do get anxious, it's usually I stop breathing, right? I don't realize it, but I'm not breathing normally. And so I have to slow myself down to breathe. But that took experience of going through that time after time to realize this is what's happening. I need to slow myself down. I need to
Hmm.
take some deeper breaths. I need to just focus on and breathing for a moment to get myself back into that space to be present for what really matters. It's really interesting how from performance to you can go from performance to presence and like the connection there is so tight, right? Like you can't have one without the other,
Hmm.
right? I'm not sure I realized that until you basically, you walked me through it, what your experience was like. So when you transitioned from performing and you got into talent strategy and coaching, did you wrestle with identity at all? Like, how did you feel going from performing on these big stages to working more directly with smaller audiences?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did, but kind of in the opposite way as a lot of my musician colleagues did. I had always been kind of like a very omnivorous, interested in all sorts of different things person. As a kid, all the way through college, whatever, and eventually had to funnel into, you have to do something. And I think there were a lot of reasons why I ended up on the path I chose, which is, maybe a separate thing. But I always had this feeling that was part of my core identity, like underneath even the professional, the singing, aspiring singer part was like, oh, but then I'm also something else. Like I'm gonna do that and I'm gonna do this other thing. And this was true of when I was in high school, I was like in 9 different activities at any given time. If I was in two, I tended to get kind of lazy. But if I was in seven, then I was like really on top of all of them. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Um, so I was also diagnosed with ADHD like much later in life. And in retrospect, I was like, oh, that explains a lot. Pressure had to be at a certain level, or there had to be a conductor like bringing a stick down. And then I'd be like, well, now I can focus. Or I had to be very interested in something just for whatever reason, so I did really well in school because I was really interested in a lot of things.
Yep.
At that point, later, that became difficult because, I always had survival jobs when I was singing, most of which were not particularly interesting. Although I enjoyed my colleagues. I taught English for a while. I liked where I worked. I liked my colleagues, but the, the benefit was that I could leave for 6, 7 weeks at a time if I had a gig. And they were okay with it. So it paid the bills a little bit, or at least made it easier, and it had the flexibility. But what started happening is, the deeper problem with my identity was, or challenge was, that part wasn't so interesting. And it certainly wasn't something I was going to like bring up at a dinner party as something I was very proud of. And there's reasons for that maybe in retrospect I'm easier on myself. But so I was like, okay, I do this, but I love it when I do one or even two other things. And so when the talent strategy works happened, I kind of fell backwards into, but the real quick identity there was like, oh, now I have something else to really sink my teeth into, and I can keep the other thing. And in fact, this ended up being a really big item, which later, but that mix was like, I was like, I'm not going to just do that either. I'm going to have this really fun thing where I do the singing thing, and then I hang out with my singer people, and then they're like talking about their lives, and I get to tell them, oh, I have this totally other thing. And I'm going to turn around and I'm go to these tech people and say, oh, I have this totally other thing. And I'm going to feel really great. So that was, so it was a weird thing that kind of brought back a side of myself that, again, this isn't how I was thinking about it at the time, but it kind of, I liked that identity for a while. I did not really think through the sustainability of this dual identity necessarily, which is a separate issue also. But I really liked that. And so when it was working, there were some years there where I felt like really in the groove. I was like getting more interest in gigs. I was singing at bigger, more prestigious places. And then, my client list was getting more interesting.
Yep.
So I was like, it's so cool to be able to do both. Nobody else gets to do that in this very unique mix. So this is really fun.
That's really fascinating. Like, to me, it sounds like in that period of time, you were chasing passion to some degree of like, you had these two different interests and, your teaching English wasn't really necessarily your passion, but as you started getting into coaching, it seems like, and maybe I'm projecting here, but it seemed like that was something that you became passionate about. At least the more you got into it, the more interesting it became. And you still had this other passion of singing. How much of your identity during that time was chasing this passion versus chasing your ambition?
That's a great question. I I will say I think it really shifted from the passion to the ambition earlier than I thought
Hmm.
without me being super aware of it
Why do
in
you think that?
retrospect. Like I think there was something it was stimulating enough to have this mix of different things. And the other thing, and this is true with people with anyone within, executive function challenges, if something is novel, that's also really great. So the novelty side of my work with tech startups this was all pretty new to me. I had been totally interested in computers as a kid and, hadn't really thought about it for 15 years. And so to see where things were, and I could kind of read and learn what these different types of engineering were all about. The novelty was high, which was very different than let's say the English language teaching, which was the same, 6 books, and this month you teach book 1 and next month you teach book 3 and so on and so forth, rinse, repeat. So I also think that level of stimulation did, in retrospect, mask a growing disconnect of like, is this even really what I want to be doing? Not to say like I didn't, I was having a good time. Maybe that's where it gets the most, it's like the sneakiest, right? Like
Sure.
I was having a pretty good time, and then when days were like kind of harder and I was like, I don't like this, but then I would get paid better than I had ever been paid before. So I was like, well, that's cool. Like that part of it feels good. And it wasn't really till I hit a couple road bumps later that were major resets that I went and really looked back and went, oh, I don't know if I was really all in on a few things that I think I would have preferred to have been in retrospect. And then, yeah, so I kind of think I faded out of that, and really it became an ambition piece by the time I was doing both in full swing, more so.
Yeah, I think that's appears to me to be common amongst the dads I talk to of like, I started doing this work because I thought I was interested in it. It was good. It kind of just gets me by. Like I have to earn a living, so that works for me. But at some point, your interests may change, they may fade, you might get tired of doing something. And it's like, okay, what do I really want to do? What can I do next? Because I only have so much time to work. And then as your life evolves, right, and you become a father and you take on these different responsibilities, it's like, okay, do I want to keep doing this work? And can I continue to do this work and still be there to do these other things in my life? You seem like you've been able to find that you were at that time still able to do that balance, right? Like you had the singing and you started doing this coaching thing and you're like, okay, I can figure out how to do these two things and I can do it in a way that is really interesting to me, right? Of like, I can talk to my singing friends about this coaching stuff that I'm doing that's really unique. I can talk to my coaching friends about the singing thing. And, like you found a way to make it work for you, especially during that transitional period of like, okay, I'm going to go from singing, maybe a little bit teaching to getting into coaching and consulting and things like that. So it's really interesting, but it's also just, and I think it is because it's really real, right? Like, I think, like I said, I think a lot of dads go through similar experiences, maybe not the same, like between an art and a consulting type project, but they are trying to figure out, okay, this is what I am good at. This is what I've been doing for so long. This is what I was interested in, but I also have these other interests I want to pursue. And how do I find that right balance? And I
Mhm.
think that, there's this identity piece of like you identified as a singer, right? I think first and foremost when you got out of college or in the arts at least.
Mhm.
And your identity shifted over time to, yes, there's still a singing element to your identity, but now there is this professional element of coaching and consulting and talent acquisition type stuff that became probably a bigger and bigger part of your identity. But there's no bigger identity shift, I think, than becoming a parent. And for you, that came through adoption. I'm really curious, what was that season like while you were still working and performing and coaching and you started to think about starting a family?
Yeah, that was really, I mean, it was interesting because it was a whole bunch of tumultuous things happened in a row, partly related to the adoption process, partly related to my personal life, and then partly related to, what happened in the world in 2020. So the timeline for me was basically I stepped away from the small business I had co-founded in somewhere in 2018, I think. At that point, so I had entered the adoption process before then, when I was fully doing everything still. And for anyone who's been in it, or for anyone who's not been in the adoption process, they may not know how much, it's a waiting game with no signal,
Yeah.
right? Once, so you apply, you do whatever class you have to do. So there's several weeks of getting paperwork together, having a social worker visit your home. Because that's part of the requirements, whatever it is. But after that's done, you're on the list, right? Um, and then you just kind of sit on the list and you're not closer to getting picked necessarily. There is they prioritize longer waiting families first, but there are so many variables that you can get picked in 2 days, you could get picked in 2 years, and there's no sign that it's like getting closer. So we had entered into this, we were waiting, and what was weird is, it didn't feel like we felt that urge of we want to be parents. And I kind of had always thought of myself as someone who was going to have kids. I was not surprised to be like, okay, now it's time. So we do all the work for the adoption, but and then you're just waiting. And in the meantime, your life is the same. It doesn't feel like nobody's getting bigger every month. We're not doing medical checkups where you're seeing that something is definitely happening. It's very abstract. What was interesting is then, when was this? Sometime mid roughly 2018, I think, is when we went down the small business. And I was a little burnt out from the tail end of that experience. And I thought, great, I saved some money. I'm going to do some creative projects. I hadn't had space to do. It had been getting a little more demanding. It had been a little harder to fit in some singing work. I was like, oh, I have a couple things I've been waiting to do. There was a product that was like ready to go. And I was like, now I have all day to do this. This would be great. I'll throw myself into it. So I do all that. And I did a little bit of consulting here and there and kind of poked around and was like, I'll just maybe explore. Who knows where I can go from here? So there was a very up in the airness, but it felt kind of fun. I think in retrospect, not that I've gone through this experience in a really long time, but it was almost like, after a breakup, like the rebound relationship thing. In terms of maybe it feels more fun than it's going to feel, 6 months after that, because there's this newfound, freedom or energy or in space in your schedule and whatnot. But then, as 2019 starts, I'm going, okay, it's been a little while. Like now it's not so fun and fresh. It's like, you initially connect with a lot of folks and then you already connected, so you can't connect again yet. And then you're going, okay, well, do I look for jobs or what do I do? And that was when I got a gig that was going to be full-time for, like a month. So I was like, well, cool. Oh, and then after that, I really got to, I don't know, full-time jobs or I'll do something. And that was when the adoption goes through. So, we went from nothing to 3 weeks later having, it was 20 days between when we first got the phone call, or not even. It was like just over 2 weeks, I think, between like the first phone call we got of there's a potential match to a tiny human in our apartment in Brooklyn. So it was a huge whirlwind. That's a whole separate story as well. But I had been hitting this kind of point of, it's starting to feel a little stagnant, at least partially. And I don't have anything else on my schedule for singing, other than this thing that was upcoming. Of course, the baby comes home while I was like going to rehearsal while there was a baby at home and I couldn't sleep. And that was very hard to do, but I remember very little of it, as you can imagine. But it was kind of like all fun in a way because it was bonkers. And then I was like, okay, fine. I mean, I have a tiny infant, so I'm doing that now. And, I always wanted to be a dad. So I was like, this could be really cool. I'm going to be like full on dad, And I would say at first that identity shift was, there was a hole and it filled it and then some, right?
Yeah.
Like very well. And I really enjoyed it. And there was so much to do. And I was so sleepy and all of the things because, we were doing, the whole tiny baby thing. And then where the timeline gets really weird for me personally is about when my daughter was just about, to turn 1 is when COVID started.
Yeah.
So again, that was when I was going, I have not talked to a grown-up who I'm not married to about anything remotely grown up for a really long time. And I'm starting to feel like, yeah, I've got that. Like, I can't find words. I can't, no one's asked me what I think about anything for literally months. And that feels weird. I never thought about that. And that's when COVID hit. So then it was like, well, you can deal with your ennui later because now it's this thing.
Right.
So then we went through a whole transition with that. And we moved across the country to try, because my husband got a new job that he was trying out. And it was just, that felt like, okay, well, I was ready for a change. And instead of getting the change I was expecting, which is like starting to consider how I'm going to re-enter the workforce, I got this completely unanticipated change. And then so like, let's just make it as complicated as possible and move across the country and do all the things, right? I think in retrospect, it was so tumultuous, both because of things that I brought and because of obviously stuff that just happened and timelines I couldn't control. Yeah, I really did not. There were a lot of things I did not sit with until later, and at that point, in terms of my professional work, I was doing a lot of coaching. Or sorry, not coaching. I was doing a lot of consulting, advising, and then actually like running, talent processes and things like that. I was not coaching yet, formally. And I think the experience of, once by the time we were in COVID for a while, of just sort of sitting there and going, okay, I kind of felt like I got to ignore a lot of major identity shifts in some respect, or at least maybe the implications of those, because the change was there were so many of them and they were so significant and unexpected.
Right.
And it kind of happened all at the same time. But that ended up being a real big piece of what I started thinking about a lot by the time I started getting more seriously into coaching work and wanted to do a more formal training.
I appreciate you sharing that. It's the mental load that you must have carried during that time. There were so many different emotions that seemed to be bubbling up there. There was excitement, but there was also fear, and there was also almost an element of boredom or lack of challenge, of needing some human interaction or adult human interaction about things that just day-to-day life, right? Like, and then you have like, oh, but also there's all these new beginnings. I'm moving across the country. I've got a new like I've got a full family now. Like I've got all these different things. I imagine for both for you and your husband, like the mental load must have been very challenging, to say the least, of just like managing those ups and downs and still being present for your child and for each other, but also for yourself, right? Like it seems like you got to the point where you wanted to get, right? But that path again was like an experience that you don't know until you've gone through. Now, I have not been through adoption. I do have dear friends of mine that went through the adoption process, and just like you, it was like years of waiting, and then all of a sudden they had days to fly across the country, pick up their child, come back home, set everything up. Like it is, I can't imagine. I can't even begin to fathom. Like I knew when my kids were coming, like within a matter of, a week or two, right? Like, yeah, there's a due date, but you don't know exactly when they're going to come unless you schedule the C-section. And even then it could still come early, or there could be complications, whatever it may be. I just can't imagine what that was like to have so many different things happening at once. Plus, we have this COVID thing that none of us have dealt with before, right? Like the mental load that to be able to manage yourself through that is just so, to me, inspirational. Of like, okay, anybody can go through a lot. And you can't always do it yourself, right? And you shouldn't always do it yourself. And I'm sure there were times that were very difficult that you wish, like, oh, I just can't wait to get through this. And there were probably other times where it's like, oh my God, it's going by way too fast. Like I'm having a time of my life playing with my newborn daughter and my spouse. And it's like, but it's just like that roller coaster of the ups and downs. And it's just like constant for such an extended period of time. I talk about transition a lot between like finding work that you're doing now to something that you really want to be doing, finding meaningful work. And that can have an emotional element to it. And it can be challenging, like, or maybe you lose your job and you don't know what you're going to do next. And now you have some more depressive emotions. But then there's also opportunity on the other side of like, okay, now I've got time to figure out what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do that. But your experience is like doing all that on steroids times 10, right? It's like you have so many different things going on. I'm just curious, like, how did you manage?
Yeah, it was, I think one part, the show must go on, like in the sense of you're just doing whatever you're doing. And I mean that in a very neutral way. I don't mean that like this was not like I did not have the Buddha's smile on my face, to say the least. It was more just like you have to go on now, even if you in the stage context, and it's like even if the other person is not there and you don't know where they are,
Yeah.
it's like you just got to go and you have to see what's going to happen. And it is exciting. It is very stressful. It's thrilling. The stress isn't necessarily bad. Nobody's gonna die at the end of the day, but it might feel really weird and probably in a very uncomfortable way. And I think there was an element of I've had like this didn't come up yet, but my husband and I many years before we were just out of college, like lived in rural China for a couple of years. And again, everything could not possibly have been more different in terms of our day to day
Right.
and the language and all this stuff. And there were some really hard moments as anyone who's lived abroad, especially in a very, very different cultural context, I'm sure has experienced. We were there for almost 2 years. First it's amazing. Then 6 months in, you're just like, I hate every single thing around me. And then you get over that hump and so on and so forth. I bring that up because I think by the time we were, let's say, like well into COVID, it was almost like, I don't want to say an adrenaline crash, but if there was a thing where, even kind of like I mentioned earlier, and I'm kind of like, if I'm doing 4 things at once, if I'm doing one, I'd rather do 4.
Yep.
If they're big, I'd rather they be a little bigger. But also, I just the randomness is exciting. Meaning, I'm not picking all of these things.
Right.
I maybe haven't. I've done one thing I've been good at throughout my life. For all the things that didn't work, that were not so easy, is if there's an opportunity, and I'm like, I don't know if I can do that, but I kind of want to try. I tend to just jump on it, making something for myself. Suddenly, halfway through COVID, that's the thing that became both necessary and the important thing. Like the most important, meaningful thing I wanted to do, I realized, is I want to stop reacting. I certainly want to stop reacting to like spontaneous global events. Because that was crazy. But
Yes.
at the same time, there was something just like, here, I can like fine, we're wearing masks in the grocery store. Well, I'll do it. Like I'll learn how to make 2 breads, not one, whatever. I mean, and I don't mean to make light of it. It's just, it was very tough too, but I was kind of like, this is what we're doing now. Okay, fine. Obviously that can't go on forever.
Right.
And so I think suddenly when we were in the new routine out West and it had been stable for, a few months and things were opening back up, and there was, and, my daughter, obviously we got out when she was a year old, but like now she's 3, now she's going to preschool. She's got, there's like a regular schedule. There's a school calendar. There's a this, there's a that, and that really, really stable routine where you're just, in my case, I was the stay-at-home parent. Like I'm just the dad. I'm so-and-so's dad. And that was the identity and I changed context, right? That's the only identity anyone knew as, basically, at that point. And suddenly that was really weird. And that was a hard transition. So it was almost like, it wasn't literally like a sugar crash, but there was an element of like, there are no big surprises being thrown my way anymore. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. It's, so day by day, obviously, with the kid. But then that was true of other stuff. I ended up getting, some consulting work and then I ended up taking a full-time job that was doing the same kind of thing. So it was very predictable. There was a little bit of a variety of clients, and that was, I think, the hardest point for me personally.
I imagine it sounded to me like until you got to that routine stage where the schedule started coming in and they're in preschool, like you are able to move forward by being comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? Like
Mhm.
to me, it sounds like, okay, we're going to go live in rural China for 2 years in a very different culture, different language, different everything. And I don't know what it's like to spend time in rural China for 2 years, but I imagine it was a lot of learning new things and, whether it's customs or words or foods, whatever it may be. Right. And you seem to almost thrive off that uncomfortableness. Right. And so like you were able to embrace what other people might find stressful to you was more of a a desire to achieve,
There
to
was,
challenge.
yeah, I would say like, and like, to be clear, there are so many kinds of discomfort that I'm to this day terrible at sitting with, but there's a certain subset where, there's like a combination of novelty and freedom to explore as long as you don't freak out. Meaning I wasn't there to, like, we were teaching it was through the college we went to, and there was you had a teaching thing already figured out for you, and it was only like 15, 20 hours a week. So you had plenty of free time to like go meet people and travel and blah, blah, blah. But the pressure was really off in the sense of like, this was not an ambitious time. It was a step, and it was before a lot of what I talked to about before, but like, it was a step away from that. I was still in grad school. I took some time off, and I had some very prestigious, fellowships on either side of it. And I had to like call my professor and be like, guess what? You are not expecting what I'm about to tell you. Guess where I'm moving? And but something about that like novelty and the stimulation, like I just would tell people I had so much fun when I first got there, and then when I decided to stay, because initially I was only going to go for a few months. Like I was like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to stay in World China for 3 months. I'm going to stay for the whole next year and another semester because everything was interesting.
Yeah.
Right. In a sense, like I have to go buy toilet paper. Interesting. There's a language there, or there's a navigation, or there's some interaction that for me, everything was stimulating to a degree that helped me roll with it in a way. So yeah, I think obviously it can be discombobulating for a lot of people, and it was for me plenty of the time. Don't get me wrong; like there's not like exclusively smooth sailing, but like overall, I loved the experience. I had so much fun. I had great friends. That day to day, like everything is an adventure.
Yeah,
that was really fun. And to tie it back to the parenting thing, I think as a lot of us know that there's, of course, the most meaningful, adventure side of it. There's definitely something that does not feel like an adult adventure. It feels more like a very boring routine that will go on forever, which of course it doesn't.
right.
It's like for this, period of time, whenever there's a problem, you're like, oh my God, like our daughter got bloody noses for a while. And it was like, oh my God, we're waking up in the middle of the night. Will this ever happen again? And then, or ever stop rather. And then one day it's gone. And, and then having that, not having a 7-year-old, obviously that kind of cycle has played out several times at this point. From what I hear, that's how it keeps going. But that was just so different because stimulating is not necessarily the first word that comes to mind for a lot of those day in, day out things. And it's not what's important, right? I think that was the other part of it, is being like, my interest level is profoundly unimportant to the task at hand, but including for me, as your values, come up in yourself as a parent in ways you didn't know until you had a kid.
Right.
And, someone going, oh, like, yeah, I like that, but I certainly can't do it. And I wouldn't. It's not like I miss it and I wish I could go back to that. I don't. But that kind of left me feeling like, well, so what do I want in this new space?
How do you think you look back now with you have a 7-year-old at home, you went through these lots of different transitions, some bigger than others, but what do you think you got right during this transition?
Like ask her in 10 years, right? So many moments I to this day don't get right. Because day in, day out, I feel like if you get 55% of your moments pretty right, you're like, this is not the worst day as a day. It really mattered to me to be less reactive than I had been previously in my life. And in a lot of different ways. But it really mattered to me to go, there's some stuff that is probably fine, but I want to change it because I think something better could be there. And I think this kid deserves it, which is very difficult. And I think a lot of parents have some version of that kind of a thing where you're going, something that's come up in me, whether it has to do with, how I was raised or how I was this, or just beliefs that I've inherited that I never questioned before because it hadn't become relevant. suddenly that comes up, and then this part that's popping up, you're realizing like, well, that's a real direct contradiction, not just intellectually, but like I feel it with this other thing that I also took for granted. And now I've got to pick which one I'm going to go with or find a third way or, whatever it is. But I do think not flinching from that reality is something that I think I am trying to get right as often as I can. let me put it that way. It is not figured out, but it is an everyday thing. It is a practice, so to speak. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I think that's what I would say.
I love that. It's like you've patience became a very real goal for you as a father. I think, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I'm sure it comes through clearly to your daughter. Like we model the behaviors, whatever behaviors we give, those are the models that our kids follow, right? And to recognize that there's this reactionary element and it's okay to react, right? Like you're going to react to things, but
Mm-hmm.
can you do it in a more effective manner, right? Is there a
Mm-hmm.
better way to do it? And you're not, like you said, you're not going to always get it right. And no parent does. And that's okay. But then how do you respond to that reaction?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I think it's only fair I asked you what you think you got right. What would you coach yourself to do differently? Is there anything that you kind of like, I probably could have done that?
Yeah. One or two things, get there sooner. No, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think the stuff I worked on, what I think I got or am getting and trying to get right is working on the things that are most important, like day by day. In the spirit of that, um, I don't know if I could have done how much sooner I could have done some of those things because it's very like start where you are. You can only start where you are. That being said, I wish I had gotten better at some of those things sooner. I think I think on the reactivity piece, what was hardest, and eventually I had some great advice and great help from wonderful and very wise people here, was not just accepting in the moment, you're going to be more reactive sometimes, and then you're going to go, oh, why did I say it that way? Or why did I throw out a punishment I knew I was not going to do? Like, whatever the thing is.
Right.
But then on the next, the same thing being a day in, day out reality, whether or not you turn it into a practice, being okay with that, being okay with being like, yeah, I am, I raise my voice sometimes and I don't want to. And the sooner I was able to go get away from the very black and white type of self judgment that I think is so understandably easy to fall into of like, oh, I can't believe I did it that way. Why am I going to do that again? Or I can't believe, whether it's or you're too progressive in a way that you're like, oh, I just let them say that. And then whatever it is, not seeing the long game, so to speak, and just being like, oh, I so wish spending too much time thinking, like, I wish I wasn't this way, or I wish I didn't have to deal with such and such an issue. It's kind of like, well, you do. So,
Right. So, like, a lot of, a lot of dads, they feel like they're reactive, but reactivity can be many things. It could be like an emotional reactivity. It could just be reacting to if you feel like you're falling behind, right? And you're just
mhm,
reacting to what's in front of you. I love your idea of like this looking at this more long term, right? You can't just look at just in that particular moment. It's reactivity is a stance over time, I
mm,
guess. Right. Like if someone feels stuck in this constant mode of reactivity, whether that's reacting to their child or reacting to the work that's in front of them or what they need to get done around the house or whatever it may be. Do you have any advice of like where you would tell a dad to begin kind of getting unstuck from this constant chain of reactivity?
yeah, I mean, it's hard. It can look different for everybody and all that. But that being said, I think for most people, that I've spoken with informally, like there's just sort of basic awareness building around like when you are feeling that reactive thing, whatever you want to call it, like what can you notice about what's happening in that moment? And especially like, check that if you're a person who like has good body awareness and do that, absolutely. For me, there was a very clear, oftentimes mental loop where it's like there was a message that's like, this shouldn't be happening right now. Where if someone's, if there's a tantrum in a public place, or if the dishwasher breaks because we were in a rental and then everything was 5,000 years old, whatever it is, but this message that I eventually, pretty quickly and with some guidance, realized preceded maybe not every single reactive moment, but like a lot of them, more than half for sure. Then it became a question of, okay, now that I've noticed that, there's a number of ways to try and neutralize it. Most of the time for me, it was like, why shouldn't it?
Yeah.
It's just as okay, we're going to accept reality instead of thinking about why something shouldn't be the way that it obviously is. And that doesn't mean that suddenly everything is solved. That certainly doesn't mean that like, your whole body is just suddenly instantly calm or anything like that. And your nervous system goes back to baseline. But it was the start of going, it's just a thing. And if I can clock into this stress, and for me, with my specific background, and remember, like sometimes you just got to go on stage and you know what? If the other person's late, the other person's late.
Right.
And if the audience knows that something is very wrong, you still will just sit there and you'll like pretend to eat the loaf of bread or whatever your stage business was supposed to be until it's like, even my dad always says something will happen. And that I think for me is if I work with somebody or just talk with somebody, informally, and that's not in there, it's kind of like, learn your tells, it doesn't have to be all of them. Just pick a couple, find a couple that seem to be in there a lot. Usually it's some version of this shouldn't be happening, or why is this like this, or that is always blank. And finding a way to deal with it that's not in reaction to that message, but is rather disbelieving that message in some way.
So it's sort of there's a couple of through lines there for me that pop out at me is like, one is slow it down, right? Of like,
Yeah.
slow it down so you can recognize what are some of these patterns that are happening, right? And then focus on what you can control versus what you can't. Like in the moment, it's already happened. Like you're not gonna be able to go back in time and stop that tantrum from happening. But it's like, okay, I recognize this is happening a couple of times. What can I do differently to, adjust the situation going forward? Right. And it's like, what's right for me? Like in this moment, what's right for those that are around me?
Mm-hmm.
And like,
And I think that last piece is so important too, which I didn't say, but like what's right for me in the sense of the whole your oxygen mask first. It's like you're part of that system and being like, yeah, I like me, I'm from the Midwest. So if we're having a public tantrum, with the kid, there's the whole world of like you don't want everyone staring at you being like, why is this? They're not that they're thinking of it, but like there's so I have to go, okay, if I bring the kid to a public place between, the ages of this and this, that does happen. I know that when that happens, at some point it will, that's going to be really hard for me. I'm going to feel like this is a disaster. I'm going to panic. I'm going to feel like whatever. And just recognizing like that's true. And I don't want to react to that feeling, but also like it's understandable why I had that feeling, given, where I came from, how I grew up, whatever all the inputs are, like the fact that this is a really hard type of moment for me to bear is not particularly mysterious, actually. So if I just accept that as part of it too, then maybe I can slow it down and get or if I include that when I slow it down, then I can get a little space to just go, I just have to do something. It might just be like, take the kid up and calmly walk to the car and buy the clothes later or whatever. But yeah, anyway, sorry. But that's really the including myself piece as opposed to like, why couldn't I have handled it better? 'Cause I feel like that's another thing that, it's very easy to fall into is like, okay, so next time I'll make a plan so that the thing that is bad, that of course will happen again at some point, but I'll tell myself that it will never happen again if I do, even if I'm intellectually aware that that's not possible, there's this emotional story of like, why did I let it happen? Like, as opposed to these things happen, let's deal with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like you you know what you want to accomplish there in these situations, right? And like you know what you
Mhm.
should do. And it's like, okay, I now need to take that time to actually do it. And I think, from what you've told me about your coaching work, you do the same thing with your clients, right? You help them. Your clients might know what they should be doing, but they don't really know how to actually do it, right? And I think
Mhm.
it's the same thing with parenting. It's like we know what we think we should be doing, but we don't know how to actually do it. What do you think gets in the way most often, professionally or at home?
Being too specific about what the should is.
Hmm.
Okay. Like, there's there's of course the version I've heard coaches say you're shoulding all over yourself. Like I should do this, I should do that. But there's a question of like the specific messages one at a time. Where is that coming from? Is this should like, I really deeply value X, and it's me saying this, or is this just like you should be on time? I'm not saying no one should be on time, but like, that's the kind of thing. And maybe I just have more flexibility there because, I didn't, when I was teaching English, it was a lot of international students who were adults. And then you learn all of these stereotypes that are kind of true. Like on time doesn't mean the same thing in Brazil as it means here. Like
Right.
that is true, and then you go live abroad and you encounter a billion of those types of things, right? So then, maybe that's like the early version of going, oh, I think everyone should blank. I was teaching students in the classroom. I was like, I think students should blank. I didn't know I felt that strongly that, about classroom procedure. But now that I'm here, I realize I don't want to be a disciplinarian of adult students. Like that's whatever I think about, whatever received messages I have about the scenario. I know I don't want to be doing what suddenly I'm finding myself almost doing, you know.
Right.
And so I think that's what, like thinking through when these like, oh, this should be like this or this should not be like that. Noticing those messages, but then really thinking, okay, that's specific. Like, where does that come from?
Yeah.
That's a lot of it because I mean, the most basic example with career searchers is like applying to jobs on LinkedIn right now is a hellscape of AI applications talking to AI filters, and they're doing whatever they're doing. They got to go on the whatever the new Meta product for chatbots is, I guess. I don't know. And people are getting past it and blah blah blah. And that's a whole ball of wax. But the number of people I speak with informally who are just like spending half their day on it because they should, because like if you don't see a high number of applications, how do you know you're even doing work? And you're going, well, that is one of many ways to measure your inputs. I don't know that, LinkedIn applications at the moment, and I'm oversimplifying obviously, but
Sure. Sure.
if you rack up 1,000, does that get you where you need to go? If you rack up 10,000, I don't think it does a lot of the time, unfortunately. I don't think there's an easy answer,
Right.
sadly, but that's the kind of thing where people will go, I don't want to go network, or I don't want to even just have, and I'm like, don't think of networking with a capital N and all of the cheesy stuff. Just have coffee with people you like, who you have professional respect. Won't say, I don't feel anything. So therefore, I should feel something happening. And for a lot of people, that should looks like a number getting bigger, a number of submitted something, a number of interviews where you get closer to the end. It doesn't include things like how excited were you about that job you got towards the end, or,
Right.
which I think should matter. There's practicalities, so I don't want to oversimplify and I don't want to minimize how difficult it is for people in that situation. But that's an example of like, if you look at the should behind the should, there's a lot of assumptions, but there's a lot of just kind of beliefs that are getting enacted without enough thought put into like, is this really going to get me where I want to go?
Right. I love that. It's, challenge the assumptions, right? Because
Mhm.
we tend to fall back on our defaults, right? And it's like, okay, well, I always was taught that a bigger number is better than a lower number, so I'll just keep applying to all these jobs, and whether they're the right fit or whether they're even actually hiring anybody or I have the qualifications for or whatever it may be. Like sometimes quality exceeds quantity, right? It just takes knowing one person or getting one introduction into the right potential role that, you don't have to apply to 10,000 jobs if you happen to get that right introduction.
Not to throw anybody under the bus. I'm not going to name it. But like, I spoke with somebody who had been like on a really tough job hunt, like longer than a year, right? We talked about some of this, kind of standard networking advice, like, never eat lunch alone or whatever, those sorts of books and things. And it sort of made sense, but this was somebody who was very kind of number oriented. A couple months later or whatever, we catch up. And not only does this person have an interview, they say, I only got it because I knew this person and I was like, that's the thing we talked about with the book about not eating lunch alone. Like that's a good thing. I mean,
Yep.
it has to happen some way. What's wrong with that? It was like, I didn't win the world's game of musical chairs, so that's bad. That means I'm bad in some way. And I was like, there are other ways to interpret that.
Right.
You know?
Right. Exactly. You actually won because you got the.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, where did those messages come from? I was like, oh, if I couldn't stand out in a crowd of 5,000, that means I'm horrible, as opposed to, I don't know, if you're the top 10 in a crowd of 5,000, you still don't get the job, but that thing's pretty good. No, because there's a concrete thing you need at the end of that rainbow. I get that there's other pressures that come up. It's not so much about saying, that's a good thing or a bad thing that this person thinks this way. It's more like recognizing, we're going to fall into default thinking that everyone does every day. Otherwise, your brain would run out of glucose by 11 a.m., right? You're going to fall into patterns that come from somewhere that you didn't pick just because like we were raised somewhere with other people and blah, blah, blah. Recognizing those things as they come up, which you're not going to do every time, but here and there, if something repeats that, you can, or if you're talking to somebody, a confidant, therapist, a coach, a friend, a spouse, whatever, who's able to reflect that a little bit for you, then you can go, yeah, why do I, not judging it, but just like, why does it feel like I lost when that completely unrealistic odds thing happens?
I love that. It's such a. It's there's a mindset shift there, right? Of it's not always a numbers game, or it's not always what you were raised to believe or became to believe. That sometimes you have to put a different lens on it.
Mm.
It's just a really intelligent way of looking at it. I appreciate that. So now I want to go from your intelligent way of thinking about this to something very unintelligent, which is my speed round.
Okay.
5 quick questions for you, have nothing to do with anything. And it starts with, what's the first kid show theme song that comes to mind?
Bluey.
Bluey. What was your very first job?
I did like, it wasn't quite telemarketing, it was like customer research surveys for local auto dealerships. And it was like 3 hours long. It felt like an eternity. I was 16. I hated it so much. It was a fine job, but yeah.
Was it in person or over the phone?
No, this is over the phone. So it was like I had a stack of papers that it was like it was a form and a checklist. I'd have to say the little intro from the specific dealership that was like, so and so personally asked me to follow up on the service for your blah, blah, blah. And then I would go through my form. Most of the time people didn't answer, right? So like I would pray for just like a chatty older person.
Yeah.
Because it would eat up 15 minutes. That was my favorite. Didn't get me to my numbers though. So speaking of getting the number.
Rare enough. Would you rather spend 24 hours with a toddler-sized T-Rex or a T-Rex-sized toddler?
I'm going to go with T-Rex-sized toddler.
Why is that?
Because I think I don't like blood. So like the teeth, you're still there,
Yeah.
like a mean chihuahua is still very dangerous.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would be very curious to see what a toddler is able to do with it on the scale. I mean, I wouldn't want them in my house, but
Right.
in some sort of assuming a safe-ish environment for that size, I think it'd be clear. Mostly I just like toddlers.
Yeah. Excellent. What's your go-to karaoke song or the one you would sing if you had to?
If they have older songs, I would do Crazy. Not the Beyonce, the can't think like. Yeah. If they got that, I'll do that one.
Awesome. That's a classic. What's the weirdest thing you've ever carried around in your bag, briefcase, or pockets?
Not too much, but I think the first thing that comes to mind is like multiple different sizes of dance belts that were owned by my school. So they were like, meaning they were not brand new, that I had to try on. Do you know what a dance belt is?
I think so.
It's basically, yeah. So it's what male ballet dancers wear under tights, and it's like a padded thong. So having like 3 of those that were like given to me by my school to be like, which one do you like the best? Like none of them, you like none of these, right? These are not fun to wear if you're not used to it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely was not what I was thinking it was, but
No. Yeah.
fair enough. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure people know where they can go next if this conversation really resonated with them. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
You can find me and my firm online at analogpractice.work. And you can certainly just Google my name, find me on LinkedIn. I am available there as well. But the website is probably the easiest way to send me a message.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes for sure. Mike, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate how straightforward and honest and yet grounded this conversation was. Like you were just, I clearly did not have the same experience that you have had. And the way you have gone through all these different experiences and the way you've managed it and still sought ambition and still accomplished so many different things. It's just so inspirational to me. I think it's just super cool. And the fact that, you know, you tackle fatherhood in a way that's, or you got into fatherhood in a way that was different than the way I got into it, but we still share a lot of the same experiences as fathers. And it's just so cool to see that there's different ways to approach it. And we all can kind of be there as dads and be our own unique selves as dads. Just the way you talked about it to me was just so cool. I just really enjoyed it. So I appreciate you joining me today. Thank you so much. I know dads listening are going to walk away with something they can apply immediately from what you talked about today. So thank you again for being here. And finally, before you go, if you're a dad listening to this and you find yourself in between navigating a season that feels different, head to gap2gig.com, subscribe to the Gap to Gig newsletter. Comes out every Friday, and it's a quieter space to reflect on work, life, and what really matters right now. If this conversation resonated, consider sending it to another dad who might need to hear it. Until next time, I'm Michael Jacobs. Thanks for showing up and listening to Gap to Gig.